Come on in, bestie. Welcome to Story Pod, where we do the doing of story development together. Brought to you by Creative BFF. Picture it. It's a cozy Saturday evening. I'm enjoying a slice of crustless pumpkin pie with whipped cream. Okay, the room is quiet, the house is quiet. I'm reading a book in one of my favorite genres. It's not the only genre that I read, I promise, but I'm reading a nice little Pride and Prejudice fan fiction, okay, by an author that in general I enjoy her books, okay? And then, like the dripping of a distant faucet, it begins. Blink. Blink. I blinked. She blinked. They blinked. We blink. Why are we blinking? This is the question that I have for you, dearest of the dear listeners. Thank you for joining me again for the StoryPod podcast. My name is Ashley. I don't know why I have to laugh at the beginning of every episode. My name is Ashley. Side note before we get started, if you have any questions about something that you're writing, please feel free to email me at ash@creativebff.com, or you can go to my website, creativebff.com, and submit your question. And I would love to answer it on a podcast. It's like my favorite thing to do is to answer story questions. But today I have another petty peeve. Now, when you're listening to this, it may be several weeks since the last Petty Peeves episode, but in the span of when I'm recording these, it's probably been maybe a week since I recorded my last Petty Peeves episode. And it's really strange because after I made that list, now if you don't know the lore, the lore is that I was on Reddit looking for story questions to answer, and somebody put up a question of what are your pet peeves, and I began to list my pet peeves in this Reddit post, question, forum, section. I don't know what they're called. I don't know. But as I listed them, I decided to make these into podcast episodes. And the oddest thing has been happening. Is it odd, or is it just that it's on my mind? It seems like 3 out of the 4 books that I've read most recently have featured one or perhaps more of these pet peeves. Now, overall, they've been generally enjoyable books. These have not been the most egregious use of these particular pet peeves. But funnily enough, the next book that I started reading gave me the next one on the list, which is the action of blinking. Now, this is not necessarily the peeviest of my pet peeves, but it is just kind of a little bit irritating to see because it's such a waste of an action usually when I see it. I'm sure that there are use cases for having a character blink, and perhaps I'll talk about some before this podcast is over. I'm really just winging it because these pet peeves are just supposed to be me giving a little bit of a rant about why I don't like these particular things. Now, blinking, whenever I see it, it feels like a wasted, empty, useless action. It's not telling me anything about the character's reaction to, like, honestly, you tell me in the comments below or wherever you are watching or listening to this, please tell me, when you read in a book that a character blinked in reaction to something that another character did or to some situation, what does that tell you? Does it tell you anything? Because when I just see the character blinked, what I imagine is that their face went slack, There was no life behind the eyes. They lost all human ability to react and reason, and they just went blank, and they blinked. Maybe it's supposed to signal that the person thinks that the one who's blinking thinks that the person that they're reacting to is ignorant, dumb. They said or did something dumb. The situation is ill-advised. I don't know, but just blinking is such a waste. And because it feels like a waste of space and time, even that short, small word, it begins to irritate me. It irritates me to see it, because I'm like, there's so many other possible reactions, or you could have just had no reaction. Let me actually read a snippet. So I will read two moments. Now, these blinks in this book, I'm literally, let me see how far am I? I'm literally 7% into the book. These two blinks happened probably within 3 or 4 pages of each other. And listen, I'm not trying to put this author on blast, so I'm not going to tell you who it is or what the book is, but let me just read, the passage that it happens in, and you tell me what you think it says about the character. Okay, so the setup for this passage, if you're familiar with Pride and Prejudice at all, is it's, basically the scene where Elizabeth Bennet's mother sends her older sister Jane to Netherfield on a horse when it looks like it's about to rain, and that's part of her matchmaking schemes. So that's the setup here, and I'm going to start with what her mother says. So, "It's only a few miles," Mama continued, adjusting Jane's bonnet as though it were a crown. "And a fine day for a ride. You shall go on horseback." I blinked, glancing at the window where the sky had taken on a distinctly gray hue. The clouds were thick and dark, promising rain that might begin at any moment. On horseback? So that the POV in this particular moment is of Elizabeth Bennet. And you saw where it said she blinked and she glanced out the window at the sky. What does the "I blinked" tell us about that moment? You could have just said, "I glanced at the window where the sky had taken on a distinctly gray hue. The clouds were thick and dark, promising rain that might begin at any moment." On horseback, the question coming after that description gives more than enough for us to, I guess, imagine what Elizabeth might be feeling in this moment with her mother sending Jane. But what does the "I blinked" give us? Nothing at all. It's not giving me anything except for annoyance. Okay, so the next scene, which actually only happens like 2 pages later. Now, of course, this is a retelling, so it's not following Pride and Prejudice exactly, but the setup for this is Mr. Darcy is in his London townhome, and he's getting ready, or he's considering leaving, going back to Netherfield. Okay, so he says, "If I left now, immediately I could be back at Netherfield just after dark. I'd miss supper, but Bingley wouldn't mind, and frankly, I would rather that than trouble Mrs. Hodges to make up my room for just one night. Besides, then Georgiana would hear I was in town, and I would have no peace until I called on her and Lady Matlock, smoked some cigars with my uncle, got dragged to the club with Richard, ... I made my decision. No need for supper, Mrs. Hodges. I'll be leaving again shortly." She blinked, clearly surprised, but only nodded. "Very good, sir. Shall I have your room prepared for your return?" So again, in that scenario, what does the housekeeper blinking tell us about anything? Because then the next line is that you're telling us that she's confused. So you're telling us the emotion that would cause the blink, technically, but then you don't need the blink. The blink is extraneous. It's unnecessary. It's fat that you can trim. So I think that the reason, or at least one of the reasons that this action, giving a character this action in response to anything, feels so unnecessary, is because blinking is such a unconscious action that we do multiple times per second all day long. We have probably I don't know what the math is. You can tell me what the math is, but we probably blink billions and billions and billions of times over the course of our life without even thinking about it. You don't have to tell yourself, I blinked. You don't necessarily notice when you blink unless there's something like in your eye is watering, you're trying to hold back tears, you're staring at the sun, and so you're blinking and squinting and things like that. So blinking is not something that you think about in order to happen. So I think that's probably why it just feels useless and unnecessary, and it doesn't tell us anything about the character reaction. And so it's something that can absolutely be crossed out in editing, especially if you then go on to tell us or show us or suggest what the character's reaction to whatever is happening is going on. Because blinking is just, they've been blinking the whole conversation. Elizabeth has been blinking the whole time her mom has been talking. The housekeeper has been blinking the whole time she's been looking at Mr. Darcy. So why are we calling attention to her blinking in response? A blink is very rarely a response. But let me think of some times when it could be. Okay, so I went away for a moment to make a list of possible times in your book, your writing, when blinking as an action might be something that can be kind of interesting, but I feel like you have to write it specifically in an interesting way and not just, I blinked and looked out the window. That's boring, okay? So I don't know if you just heard the little paper hit the microphone. So one example would be to use a blink as a measure of time. And now this is a cliche because, we have the saying, in the blink of an eye, to kind of measure time and to suggest that something happened very quickly. But in writing, I was specifically picturing a scene in maybe like a sci-fi book, or maybe even in a horror, but more so in a sci-fi book where the character is maybe moving very quickly through a crowd, and so they blink and they're there, and then they blink and now they're, some number of meters or feet ahead at the whatever, and so they're blinking through. And the way I'm saying it right now would not necessarily be how I would write it. I would hopefully write it much more eloquently, but the image is of the character using blinking as a measure of how quickly they're moving from place to place, or something like that. And then in another use, I was imagining a character blinking slowly, like a very slow blink. But the way I might the comparison that I might draw would be to maybe compare it to an animal that, is known for blinking slowly, like a bullfrog or a house cat or a lion at rest. And all of those give very different, evocative impressions. They tell us something about the character because, we're imagining the slow blink of a lion. And when you hear that, to me at least, when I think of a lion at rest blinking slowly, there's a level of confidence, a level of deadly ability and strength, some aspect of laziness, strength under restraint, that kind of thing. Or if it's a house cat blinking, what is the image that she blinked like a house cat lying in the sun, whatever. Say it better than that. But what image does that give us of the character that's doing the slow blink? Maybe again, very relaxed, very confident. They own the space. They also don't really care about you. They're not pressed by anything that you're doing, and whatever else. Each person will have their own they'll have their own image of what the slow blink of a house cat lying in the sun looks like, or the slow blink of a bullfrog, so you're imagining a fat, warty bullfrog that a lot of people would think in general we say is unattractive. So if you compare somebody to that animal blinking slowly, it's kind of like, okay, well, what is that telling us about this character? So it's giving us a characterization in a more interesting way than just saying this character is like this. Another time I may use a character blinking is if I want the character that's blinking to seem empty-headed, clueless, naive. And I think maybe side note, that's part of the reason that I don't like it, because that is the impression. If you're just there blinking and there's no expression, you just kind of seem clueless. You kind of seem empty-headed, right? So if that's specifically what you want to telegraph or signal, I keep using that word. It feels right, but I don't know. But if that's what you want to signal to the reader, that they're empty-headed, they're clueless, the person is standing there smiling and blinking, and there's just nothing going on, nothing going on behind the scenes in the mind, So that could be another time that you would use blinking as a character action. And then perhaps to signal boredom. So a scene that I may use that would be if the character is sitting in a room, blinking at the wall, and just bored out of their skull. They're just sitting there blinking and nothing's going on. Just signaling that boredom and that. So again, it's kind of like an emptiness, a blankness. The fact that you are calling attention to the blinking, which is such an unconscious action, just kind of drives home how empty and boring the moment is, right? And then in the opposite to the slow blink, like what could rapid blinking signal? Maybe a state of agitation, maybe a character slipping into like a trance state, or being under the influence. So you're just imagining somebody blinking really fast, and that's signaling something about what's happening with the character, either physically, psychologically, maybe even emotionally. Maybe they have taken a drug or something and it's causing them to blink rapidly and they're sweating. So you're combining the blinking, the action of the blinking, with other physical signs. Perhaps they're, if they're blinking rapidly and they're speaking in disjointed sentences that aren't making sense. And so what you're showing us that this character is going through a wild mental state. Something wild is going on with this character, or something out of the ordinary is going on with this character. And the blinking is just one of the signals that we're getting that the observing character is having, or even if the point of view character is experiencing this rapid blinking, what are they feeling in their body? They're vaguely aware that they're blinking rapidly, and they're kind of shaking, and they can't control what they're saying. Whatever the case may be, whatever's happening inside of them at that moment. And there may be other ways to use blinking in your writing that actually tells us something about the character or the situation, what they think. But just an empty, boring, I blinked and I looked at the clouds outside. The housekeeper blinked at me, and then, she was confused, but she said this. That's useless. Let's trim the fat. Okay, let's trim the fat off of this steak a little bit. Okay. But yeah, that's what I think about blinking, and it's absolutely crazy to me that I just spent like 20 minutes talking about blinking, because I 100% thought that this was going to be like a 5-minute episode, because what could I possibly have to say about a character blinking in a book other than it's annoying, don't do it, But hopefully, listen, this episode was partially rant and partially, hopefully, was helpful, giving some helpful examples or some ways, at least if you like to turn to blinking as a character action, some ways to spice it up, some moments that you may use blinking in, but don't just listen. You know what? This is a personal thing. Do what you want to do as a writer, okay? Who am I to tell you? Who am I? I'm nobody. I'm just your creative BFF, trying to make your writing great, okay? I'm trying to make you great, all right? Stop putting blinking in if it's useless. Anyway, love you. Thank you so much for joining me for this podcast. I hope to see you next time. Well, see you, feel you, across the airwaves, talk to you next time. All right. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.